Alberta has just done there was a pre-recorded video of her talk, and I'm trying to remember the whole title because it is the longest title of conference. What was that full title again, Alberta?
Oh, right, you're putting me on the spot.
Yeah, I am. Actually, wait, I do it. Going bold and proud in morning time. And then it was about the
capturing authenticity and belonging through the ancient African tradition of Rio or oral storytelling.
Okay, so a very long title, and I would have had to go and find it to read it and act like I knew what I was saying. And Alberta is from Homegrown Sunshine, SONSHINE, and really just I've always enjoyed listening to Alberta. She was a speaker at last year's conference as well, and I always just love what you've got to say. So this session is you should have gone and watched the recording first. And we are here to discuss and ask questions. So if you want to turn cameras on, you can. If you want to speak, you can. If you want to raise your hand, you can. And if you want to put questions in the chat, you can. So would anyone like to kick us off with a question? And Amy's put the website in the chat. So yeah, any comments on the video? Who's had a watch? And would you like to give any comments? They're a quiet bunch. Christine.
I'll just say thank you for reminding me of really a history of how things are. I suppose this is going to turn into a question now, if that's okay. So my childhood, I can remember reading my father's books. So there was an Aesop's Tales book. But, you know, looking for my grandson 40 odd years later, nothing. You can't, you know, very difficult to find these sort of things, except in a car boot sale, we found a book about the Great Goat Chase. And that was about a busy bee. It wasn't a spider this time. You spoke about the spider, and you know there are lots of spider stories. But the busy bee, how can you do that? You're just a busy, teeny weeny busy bee. Anyway, thank you for doing that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I don't know if you needed to respond to that, but Amy's put a question in the chat. I didn't quite get to finish the video as I started it a bit late, which is fine. You know, we're here for a bit, so, you know, it's great. So you may have answered this at the end. Would you do any follow-up after telling the story, or let it speak for itself? Would you ask the child to narrate it, or ask them some questions about it, or anything else? Which is a really good question, actually.
Thanks, Amy, for that question. Yes, I do cover that at the end of the story, the talk, and it really just depends on your child. I think with the I don't analyze the story with the children. I tend to ask them questions to get a sense of what my son, to get a sense of what he understands. I definitely ask him to narrate it back. And what I do say is try and make that as creative and interesting as possible, especially if you're trying to facilitate that culture of storytelling. So I would ask him to reenact it or to tell it with a funny accent or something like that. So make it as playful. And the idea is that the child then embodies the story as their own. So yes, definitely ask for narration. And in terms of the moral of the story, I do ask questions about that. What do you think the story is about? Is there anything else? What do you think the other person's perspective? What would the mother-in-law think, or the wife, in this context of the story that I explained? So yeah, definitely is food for thought.
That's great. Thank you. I hope that answers your question, Amy. I think it's a little bit also like when you want your child to do creative writing, you don't want them to feel like it's work, or like, you know, and you don't want to also spend a lot of time criticizing and picking it apart if they don't do it right, because that could actually be part of them making it their own as well.
Yes.
If they change it a bit and do it a little differently. So Yeah, I think that's a good question. And also children have a way of rebelling if they think you're trying to make them do anything or trying to teach them.
You know, don't say that too loud. My son's in the background.
Sorry. But he's a good boy, isn't he?
It's true. It's so true.
A great example. So
Yeah.
let me just see somebody else come up with something. Okay, so Amy's happy with that answer. Anyone else have a question? So we've just added in Sandrine to the chat as well. So Sandrine, we just I hope you've had a chance to go and watch the video. So Alberta's here to answer any questions. The one we've just answered is a question about whether you'd get the child to narrate or tell it back, or would you explain it and all of that, which Alberta said, you know, she wouldn't sort of analyze it, but she might get them to be creative in telling it back to her, just making it their own. So you're welcome to also pop questions in the chat or to raise your hand, or even just speak up. We don't, you know, we're not a huge group, so we can manage that. And otherwise, we can just
I have a question that I could throw at everyone to see.
Yeah.
I think the way I talked about storytelling was very much coming from the outside in. And I wonder to what extent people here use oral storytelling, whether it's from Norse mythology or from Celtic, Gaelic mythology, to inform your children about your history. Do you see it as your history, or is it just education? Is there any kind of personalized storytelling from your childhood that you bring to your homeschool?
That's a good question. Does anyone want to answer that? Enrich the conversation with your thoughts. Was that you, Amy?
It's trying to open the chat box, and the pause recording is literally the next option down. So if the
okay, as long as it's fine, as long as it's paused, it's fine. Oh. Yeah, we're fine. So there was a question. If people want to come back to us on that, on Alberta's question, that's fine. And I've just put your website back in the chat just because people only see what's happened since they've been there. Okay, so so first of all, Christine said, do you think our society is becoming more serious? Is it about a push to hurry children to grow up? So I think, I don't want to read too much into it, Christine, but I think what you might be saying is that we're losing some of the fun and the enjoyment of some of these things that really made childhood so magical and amazing and fun.
Yes.
How do I start that question, answer that question without it becoming another talk? Yes, I do. I think I've also been guilty of that as well. I, tend to want my child to, go through things and learn. But I've slowly had to adapt that because I do like that playfulness and bringing wonder and imagination into our learning. I think this is why I like Charlotte Mason's philosophy, because she encourages a sort of child-led approach. And when you look at the world through the eyes of a child, you will stumble on wonder, you will stumble on creativity.
That's Amy. Go away,
yeah,
Amy.
I do think screens, I think schools and all of these things are pushing children towards adulthood too quickly. Definitely schools do that with the sort of pressure for exams and learning by rote. All of that is stopping children from playing and being imaginative. So yes, I would agree that our modern society is doing that. And homeschooling is a way of saying no to all of that and keeping children in wonder and imagination a lot more.
And that's so true, Alberta. When we moved to the UK, we moved into a house that was empty and all our stuff was on its way. And one family donated to our children a doll's house for them to play with because their daughter was done playing with it. She was 7. And I remember thinking, she's 7. How can she be done playing, done with the stage? how can she be done? And really just been quite shocked by that. And it is something I've observed specifically, in the UK compared to South Africa, which is my only other reference point, is, that we just had different childhoods. We played a lot more, we were outdoors a lot more. I think it's got a lot to do with the indoor nature of this country, that the weather kind of keeps you indoors for so long, and so we kind of become reliant on some of these other things to amuse our children. But certainly the school day is so long that there's very little time for play and fun if children are in school. And so home educating is really such an opportunity to give our children that gift. I do think it's an indecent, it's not actually working, by the way, this whole push to get children to grow up. It's not working. It's backfiring horribly.
It is. Well, it just means that the screens are taking over the imagination of children, and for the worse, really. I've had similar experiences when my son was about 9, and we went for a play date, and his friend's room, all the toys had been boxed away because the child was no longer interested in playing with their toys, because he'd just received an Xbox or a PlayStation, and that was his thing. He told his mum, I don't want my toys anymore, I'm not interested.
Yeah.
Whilst we had toys all over the place, labeled and boxed. They were the same age. So no, I think screens have a lot to do with that. I think school, pressure of school, has a lot to do with children not wanting to play as much anymore.
Yeah, I must say we do have screens in a house, but they are regulated. So there's a very specific time, and then so that's kind of helped a lot, because it's just never been questioned. It's always been a thing that's the time you can be on a screen. So they've kind of accepted it, and they go off and do other things. They don't nag or anything. So Sandrine had a really good question, and I think you're going to enjoy this question. She said, I'm French and looking for ways to incorporate my French culture, language, etc. into my home ed. My girls very much identify as French. Now, I would think there must be a rich French tradition of storytelling too. And Sandrine, do you know a lot of stories that come from your native homeland? Where's Sandrine? You can, if you want to chat, you can, Sandrine. So I just want to see if she's adding.
I was just going to say, I think you must have a treasure trove of stories and books and bits of history that you can bring into your home, or to make sure that your children keep their French identity. I think also festivals and food and all of these different things are things that you can draw from, listening to French podcasts. But there's an array of things you can draw from, but I think specifically stories, those folk songs and folklore that you grew up with, especially ones that incorporate your life story as well. I think children are interested in their parents' upbringing, their childhood. So I think when you embody the spirit of the stories yourself, it brings it to life, because you could say, I was this age and this is where I was with this cousin or that brother, we lived in this area when I heard this story, and suddenly that gives the impetus to the child to want to carry on that story, because there is a personal link to the story. So I would encourage you to not hesitate, to keep on telling your story, keep on bringing in books, keep on bringing in French films, and and things like cartoons that the children can read, make it as playful, and even games, childhood games. I've taught my son many games I used to play as a child. I was in Sierra Leone. I was born in Sierra Leone. I came to UK when I was 7 years old. So a lot of the stories I'm telling you, I remember until I was about 7, but still remember them, and I'm able to share that with my son now.
And that's what I'm thinking. As you're speaking, I'm thinking, because the thing is, because we are very much in a screen age now, we have to refer back to our own childhoods as what were those stories. And fortunately, sometimes you can get hold of those books and things online now, which might have been harder to get hold of those. But also, like what you were saying about telling her own stories. But then maybe, you can make them more colorful, more interesting, and lots more detail, which would give them an insight into that French way of growing up, how people were, how the different characters in your life were. you know, and how they acted, that could all be brought in and paint that picture, because that's what stories do, is they paint a picture in your imagination, don't they?
Absolutely. And I think also idioms and parables, expressions, such a powerful way. I mean, to know if someone really, a person knows a language is their ability to speak with idioms, right? So I think those things, even the way we correct, rather than don't do that, you could just throw in an idiom, which it's easy to remember those phrases that our parents used to tell us over and over again, you know, than to spell things out all the time. So I use that a lot, and also have discussions around what they mean.
I actually did find that a bit funny, because I speak the tiniest bit of Zulu, really tiny, but I know one idiom, and that doesn't, there's no indication that I know the language. So anyway, it's about the fish jumping out of the water, and that's about it.
Oh yeah, I know
yeah,
that
keep it manzini. So when it's very hot, they say it's, you know, basically it's so hot the fish are jumping out of the water. It's
okay.
okay. So Amy's got another question. Oh, so Lucy had a question first. What do your children do in their free time? What does their learning day look like? Now that's a whole other, slightly other topic almost.
Yeah. Briefly, I think in context of the talk, when I do morning time, I do encourage my son to keep his hands busy. So he could paint, he could draw, he could doodle, or fix up. When he was younger, he'd fix puzzles. He would always keep himself busy when we're telling stories. Equally, if he's listening to a book, if I'm reading aloud, or we're listening to a podcast, it's really important to get his hands busy. Otherwise, it just degenerates into something else, as I'm sure you all know. But yes, within the context of this, when I am talking, or his hands are always busy.
That's great. And then Amy said she's just wondering what benefits you feel the storytelling gives you. We actually do something a bit similar, but I would read the story from a book. Then my children, aged 7 and 6, usually draw a picture, and then I ask them to tell me the story back, and I type it up for them and stick it to the back of their picture. I'm taking a Charlotte Mason unschooling approach /unschooling approach. I think it's building their memory, but I'd love to know if you've been doing this longer with older children, what other benefits you've seen.
Oh, fantastic strategy, Amy, especially for younger children. And I think it's really powerful for kids to see their own words written up, and just shows them the power of their voice. But yeah, I do talk about some of the benefits at the end of the video, such as, I think, reading aloud, telling stories, morning time, that whole space of bringing sense making through stories, do bring a deep sense of connection within a family. They bring a sense of shared values, because stories always embody value sets and the moral imagination, especially if you're talking about fairy tales and folk tales. They are communicating values and wisdom in a sort of relaxed, imaginative way. So there is that. There is the fact that it makes you feel like you belong to the shared learning space. And they give you a reservoir of things to draw from the rest of the day. They feed your imagination, as I said on the talk. And so across, I would find that it will tell a story. I'll read a folk tale, and we'll read another story. So for example, whilst I told this story, I would read Aesop's fables, and then would read Shakespeare, and my son will make the connection between the value that he learned from the folk tale to a character's behavior in Shakespeare, for example, because he could see what it is that you're being warned about. So there is that. I think narration, having the child tell the story back, improves memory. It improves confidence. It gives you ability to perform. You can infuse your own personality into the character in the way you tell the story. I don't think I've ever told that brass spider story twice, the same way twice, you know. There's always something else that I add to it every time I tell that story. I think it definitely connects the child to feel that they're part of a long legacy. So it brings that intergenerational connection as well. It feeds into creative writing. I believe that the school system doesn't allow children enough time to begin to think and create before they have to start writing. when a child begins to tell stories, retell stories, create their own stories first before they're pushed to write, then the writing process is almost, it's one step removed, and you don't have to do the two things at the same time. First, you learn to think, you start to create, and then once you learn the skill of writing, it will then become effortless because the thinking has already been developed. So there are so many benefits to read aloud. I think research suggests that even up till when a child are in their teens, it's valuable to get to read aloud to them. There is power that comes from children hearing beautiful stories, beautiful vocabulary, big concepts from the mouth of their parents. It makes the ideas accessible to the child. They don't think it's foreign or something over there because they're used to hearing it in their home. So I can continue with the list of benefits, but it's really out there. Keep doing it. It's beneficial from when they're little. From in utero, start reading, start telling stories to the children, singing to them. It's powerful.
There's a book that I read called The Read Aloud Handbook. Have you ever read that one at all?
No.
I think it's Jim Trelease's. I'm looking at it on Amazon. I'll put the link in now. I'm assuming it's the same one that I've read, but actually I think they even spoke about how in university, like this professor or somebody, would read to the students and how they loved, they'd listen, and we listen. We love a story. And I think that it is very powerful just in, if you want to look at the Bible, for instance, it's the stories people remember, and Jesus tended to use parables to get a point across, and you remember the parables far more than you would like, a whole moralizing sermon. And Aesop's Fables is based on the same thing, and Rudyard Kipling's, I think he also did a book, of tales or something.
Yes,
tales,
yeah. And also Sarah Mackenzie's Read Aloud Revival is a really good one for homeschoolers. There's Sarah Clarkson's Story Form Child. All of these books are about the power of reading aloud to our children. I would say, I think I have a blog that I can find and send later that I've written about this particular thing, reading aloud, and why it's so important to children. I mean, schools still do it. The children read aloud if they're looking at a novel. Universities, they still do it. So it's important. In fact, the Bible was written to be read aloud. We've just turned to a personal reading, but it was always meant to be read. All the letters in the New Testament were read aloud first.
True, that's true. Okay, so I've got Sandrine said they've tried the Charlotte Mason suggested books, but it often feels quite heavy and serious and overbearing. But the principles, I think, can be adapted, example with fables or oral stories or picture books, and alongside a play-based education.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But Charlotte Mason's not meant to be a sort of didactic philosophy to follow. It's meant to be principles that you apply. And this is what I was trying to say in my talk, that I have appropriated her philosophy to work for myself, for me to bring in my own culture, for me to bring in my Christian identity, and also to adapt to my child's way of learning. He's quite kinesthetic, he's quite creative, and also for a long time he was an only child, which meant that, I had to get involved. I had to get into the play with him on the creative aspects of whatever I was doing with him, or let him have a go. So we sort of co-created together, so that it didn't feel hierarchical. I was this teacher talking to him and doing things to him. So you've just got to, it's very modular. You've got to play around with it to see what works for you, and keeping the central principle that we are facilitators of our children's education. And actually it is the child that picks what they want from what we lay on the table for them.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. I'm busy putting it in the chat now. So I used Sunlight Curriculum initially, which is actually very much based on Charlotte Mason. Initially, it was literature based, And even though it's American, they have actually a great list. You can actually, I think you can actually see their lists online on their website of what the books are that the child will do at different ages, but they actually have read alouds specifically listed in their curriculum. So alongside whatever the child might be reading, there's read alouds, because reading aloud also improves your child's vocabulary, because you can read to them at a higher level than what they could read themselves, because you're explaining as you go as well. We're going to have to jump quickly to a couple more questions, just so we can get it. When your child starts to write a story but gets disinterested, what do you do to encourage them to finish it?
That's an interesting one, and I could write a book on that, just because my son still struggles to write till today, and we have found different ways. I think the suggestion that Amy made at the beginning of looking at different ways of writing a story. So, for example, having them narrate the story and you write it for them. And having them narrate it into your phone, and then later get them to write it, maybe looking at different forms of writing, maybe exploring that there might be sensory issues there with writing, and not just assuming that they're just reluctant and difficult. Because I did that with my son for a long time, thinking, you understand this, your vocabulary is great, your handwriting is excellent, why wouldn't you just write, you know? So it's taken me a long time to unpack that actually this is something he just finds difficult. And so we've looked at typing, we've looked at video recording. There are so many different things. But I think also maybe getting them to draw first before they write is a good thing. I think narrating their story, what they've written already, back to them, so that they see actually this is something that, you know, it is good and it, you know, worthy of listening to hear you tell them. There's something that I think when you step back and hear somebody read what you've written, that makes you think, oh, I can't believe I said that. So there is no set hard and fast rule. I think it's just keep pressing the buttons and see what works for your child. Learn about, you know, why they find writing difficult. It could be a sensory issue. It could, you know, just be that the writing process itself is very, very difficult for them. I hope that at least touches some buttons for you.
Yes, and Breen also mentioned about how, you know, there seems to be a pressure to move on to bigger and thicker and more intellectual chapter books earlier and earlier. I personally can say I love a book with brilliant pictures, and I will go and look for a book with beautiful pictures, because, you know, that makes a child want to hold that book and look at it and get into the pictures and go and see what's going on there. And that sort of stimulates the imagination, I think, even more.
Yeah, I agree. I think in terms of reading, again, I've made so many mistakes with that. And my son reads quite advanced for his age. And then he got to a point where he just won't read past what I was giving him, not because he couldn't, he just didn't want to. I mean, he started reading chapter books from when he was 5. And I was certainly like, okay, well, on to the next thing. And in fact, I stopped reading to him because of pressure from school, because I thought, well, he could read the chapter books, he doesn't need me anymore. Once we started homeschooling, we did all of that, and I started to read to him, and we read everything. And now he even enjoys reading the baby books for his baby brother, you know, and doing just the rhyming of it. So our morning time includes things from, you know, Julia Donaldson to J.R.R. Tolkien. So it really doesn't. I don't think it matters so much. I do think it's good, like Juliet said, to challenge the child's level in terms of what they read. So if I want to introduce my son to a theme or a book that he is reluctant to read, I would offer to read it out loud, or I would play an audible version of that book. And usually once that he gets into it, he then wants to start reading it. Or I'll introduce the book through a film. I definitely did that with The Lord of the Rings. We watched the films first, and then we started listening to the books, and we still keep going back and forth. Even this morning he read a chapter from The Hobbit, and we had a discussion on that chapter. So whatever works, watch your child, follow your child, see what their interests are, and follow it. I think you can never go wrong from that rule. The curriculum or the curricula that we see out there, they're there as a guiding principle, but the end of the day, the child is the curriculum. You've got to follow what works for them.
Yeah, and I was going to say, normally, like for me, I always say, read the book first before you watch the film, but it doesn't always work. I mean, The Lord of the Rings is a hefty read and film. I'm not actually into the film that much, but and I generally say that films that are based on a story are often very good films. If they're well made, they're very good films. But we're going to have to wrap that up here. And I just want to thank you, Alberta, just for what you've brought today. It's really rich and wonderful. And if anyone wants to go back and rewatch her video, it is already there. So and then we will have this Q&A available to watch back as well. I think, you can contact Alberta if you've got any other questions. But yeah, we really enjoy everything you bring, and also you're on Instagram, Alberta, aren't you? So do you want to put your Instagram?
Please, yes, thank you so much.
What is that in the chat? What
it's
can I
homegrown. I can type it up.
Okay, good, but probably better.
I mean, it's been absolute pleasure. Thank you for your stimulating conversation, questions, and feel free to reach out to me on Instagram or on my website if you have any questions. I do have resources that make the whole morning time process or culturally diverse morning time process easy as well to look at. They need updating, but perhaps the more stimulation I get, the more I see that there's a appetite for it. So please reach out and let me know what your thoughts are. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. There was just some chat about like the kind of the early readers and so on. And I agree that I think some of the books children are sort of subjected to at school actually put them off reading because they don't engage the imagination as they should. They're not a rich meal for them.
You go to the library and it's a free reign. You can pick any books.
Yeah.
Anything.
Yeah. But even then, there's a lot of twaddle out there.
He goes for the picture books, like all of the larger ones that have got lovely big illustrations, and I have absolutely no problem with it whatsoever.
I think there's a lot of titles out there that don't do much for children, so I do tend to go back to the classics quite a bit, actually. The good old
I'm a big
stories.
Classic.
Like even Charlotte's Web and those sorts of stories, lovely stories.
But Wind in the Willows is quite difficult to get your mouth around sometimes.
I think
I tried to get my son into Wind in the Willow and he just wasn't interested. No. We listened to it and we watched, the theatre production. And I was okay with that because, you got to pick your battles. Some things he loved, some things he just didn't.
Yes. And it is just true that your children are not you. So what you loved is not going to always work for them. So, you just keep trying, and you have to have lots of different things around in your house. And but I think that particularly the storytelling's been so valuable, Alberta. I think just don't stop telling stories to your children because it's an extremely powerful medium, I think, to convey ideas and thoughts and morals, values, all sorts of things. So I just want to say thank you for that and for sharing that with us this morning.